Inertial Electrostatic Confinement Fusion. This report is intended to provide the reader with an overview of the basics, current experimental status, supporting theory, and potential applications of inertial electrostatic confinement, IEC, fusion. Emphasis is placed on work in these areas at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, although some other research is brought in. The report shows that IEC is a unique approach to fusion in that it offers a number of spin-off applications, such as a small neutron source for neutron activation analysis on the route to fusion power. The report further shows that IEC is one of the few potential fusion approaches that can potentially burn in neutronic fuels like P11B, hydrogen, boron 11. In a neutronic fusion, neutrons carry no more than 1% of the total released energy, greatly reducing problems associated with neutron radiation. That ability, combined with its simple mechanical structure and small size, make the IEC reactor, if achieved, an ideal fusion power unit. Present experimental devices are 4 to 5 orders of magnitude below break-even, energy out/in equals 1, energy gain for P11B. However, it is argued that the ability to study the physics in very small volume plasmas makes it possible to rapidly investigate scale up to a power-producing device. As an example, the report concludes with a conceptual experiment proposed for demonstration of break-even conditions for P11B using a hydrogen plasma simulation. The author has purposely tried to avoid use of equations in this report to enhance readability and to stress concepts rather than analysis. However, considerable analysis is provided in a number of the source references cited. Section I. IEC Background and Basics. Before considering detail, it is helpful to obtain a rough idea of how inertial electrostatic confinement, IEC, fusion works. For this purpose the experimental IEC device of Figure 1.1 is considered. As shown, this gridded type IEC has a spherical mesh grid suspended on a high voltage feed-through in the center of a metal vacuum vessel. The fusion fuel, for example deuterium gas, is first fed into the chamber originally prepared at high vacuum, for example 10-7 torr. The fuel gas brings the pressure up into the tens of torr region. Then the voltage on the grid is raised into the many kV range, creating a plasma discharge between the high voltage grid and chamber wall, electrically grounded. The high negative voltage on the grid serves to extract the ion from the plasma, accelerating them towards the center of the grid where in principle they interact and fuse. In practice however, the scattering cross-section is larger than the fusion cross-section. Thus many ions scatter without reacting, fusing. Many near misses essentially pass straight through the center of the plasma core and exit. This dominance of scattering over fusion reactions is the central issue of all fusion confinement approaches, forcing use of strong confinement so the ions have many passes and hence a good probability of fusing before being lost from the fusion reaction chamber. In the IEC multiple passes occur because the ions are trapped in a potential well created by the buildup of positive charge due to the large flow of the accelerated ions into a small core region in the center of the negative grid. Viewed in another way, the ions extracted from the region between the grid and the wall can scatter and pass back through the grid, but can only return to the same potential surface they were born on. Thus they cannot reach the vessel wall, but instead lose their kinetic energy, stop, and are accelerated by the grid potential back into the center of the grid. This then provides many recirculations through the center of the grid volume where they have a finite probability of fusing. If not for the existence of various lost channels such as hitting the grid, charge exchange, or upscattering in energy, the ions would be prematurely trapped in the potential well until they fused. The conventional requirement for fusion confinement is given in terms of the confinement parameter, Nt, where N equals the ion density and T is the confinement time. Also the ion energy, or temperature T, must be in the 20 or more key range assuming DT fuel. For break-even, J. Lawson developed his famous criterion that equals 1014 cm to 3 seconds at T greater than 15 key for DT fusion. Here T equals energy confinement time, second, N equals ion density, cm3 and T equals ion temperature or average energy. The Lawson criterion is independent of the confinement method, but does depend on the fuel via the selection of cross-sections in the derivation. Magnetic confinement is generally limited to N 1014 cm-3 by pressure balance. Then a confinement time of 1 second is required. For inertial confinement fusion, ICE, or laser fusion, compression of targets can achieve in 1024, so a confinement time of only 10 to 10 seconds is needed, corresponding to the disassembly time of the compressed target. For a general review of energy break-even requirement for DT fusion and other fuels like D3 He and P1113, the reader referred to, G. Miley, Fusion Energy Conversion, American Nuclear Society, LaGrange, Illinois 1973. Now consider the IEC. In principle, the ions focused on the center of the IEC can achieve a density of Nru 1016, giving a required confinement time of 10 to 2 seconds for DT fusion break-even. This time can be restated in terms of the number of ion recirculations in the IEC potential well by dividing the well diameter by the average velocity of the recirculating ion. In later cases discussed in this report, this number is typically quite large, usually minus 1000 recirculations. Achievement of this large number of recirculations requires strong reduction of all of the loss channels noted earlier. Grid losses can be reduced by star mode operation discussed later, where the recirculating ions possess beam-like trajectories passing through the center of the grid opening. The ideal, however, is the elimination of the grid altogether, which can be done via formation of virtual potential structures, originally proposed by Farnsworth and discussed in following sections. The temperature requirement also leads to a fundamental difference in the IEC physics versus other confinement approaches. Note that temperature is not a proper term here, since it implies an equilibrium distribution, while the IEC is far from that with its beam-like ions. Thus, the reader should view temperature as meaning average energy of the ions. In doing that, however, it is assumed that the ion energy distribution is known so that averaging is possible. Most ions in the IEC are born near the chamber wall, so are accelerated to an energy close to the applied voltage on the grid during the extraction process. A reasonable estimate is that the ions reaching the fusion region in the center have an energy near 80% of the grid voltage on average. Thus it becomes relatively easy to achieve the loss in DT requirement by applying a voltage of 25 kV. In fact, most IEC neutron sources discussed later operate at voltages greater than 80 kV to get into an energy range, giving a higher fusion cross-section. In sharp contrast, magnetic fusion devices struggle to obtain a temperature in the 10 K range, since the entire plasma population must be heated, versus direct ion acceleration in the IEC, due to the equilibrium distribution maintained in these plasmas. Another very important point is that Lawson assumed that the ions and electrons were in thermal equilibrium, at the same temperature, T. This is a reasonable approximation for magnetic confinement, but not so for the IEC. In the latter, the electrons form a distorted Maxwellian distribution at an effective temperature well below that of the beam-like ions. Since electron energy loss processes such as radiation emission are serious, the Lawson temperature criterion must be modified for the IEC. A first rough estimate is the T/T. Less than 1/3 for DT. Here T and T are the ion and electron temperatures, respectively. Control of this ratio is a complex physics issue, involving the relative ion and electron source rates and energies and the potential well structure. In later sections, use of P11B, hydrogen boron 11, fuel in the IEC is considered. This is very attractive since it provides all charged particle reaction products, making this a unique aneutronic system. Such a reactor represents a truly ideal system from an environmental and energy sustainability perspective. However, for such fuels, the Larson criterion becomes much more demanding, increasing NR by 2 orders of magnitude and E to 150 kV. Also, for the IEC, a T/T less than 1/9 becomes essential. Using temperature ration is a very simplified representation. The radiation losses are quite sensitive to deviation in the actual energy distribution of the ions and electrons. For example, electron Bremsstrahlung emission primarily comes from the high energy tail of the electron distribution, while energy transfer with ions is dominated by the foot of the electron distribution. At high powers, interactions in these regions can become quite nonlinear, depleting or burning out the local populations in these regions. This effect causes energy losses to saturate, hence can be quite beneficial under some circumstance. However, the phenomenon is complex to evaluate numerically, so little has been reported on it for IECs to date. The very aggressive P11B Lawson requirement is employed in the design of the break-even experiment of section VI. While this discussion of IEC physics has been greatly simplified, it hopefully provides more insight into the basic concepts and issue before delving into more detail. Iec Background. Inertial Electrostatic Confinement, IEC, was conceived of by Philo Farnsworth, the inventor of electronic television, as an approach to fusion power using electrostatic fields for confinement. When he did this in 1955, the prime approaches being pursued worldwide were magnetic confinement or inertial, laser compression of targets, confinement. In fact, electrostatic confinement had been written off by most scientists due to Earnshaw's theorem, which stated that plasma could not be confined by electrostatic fields alone. That was simply an expression of the fact that use of a bias plate to confine one species, say ions, would automatically attract the opposite species, electrons, such that the whole plasma would transport to the plate. Farnsworth seemed to intuitively understand that this theorem assumed steady state, so that if, as in IEC, the ions were dynamically moving and confined, they would electrostatically confine the electrons. Farnsworth went further and realized that in a spherical system virtual electrodes would form a high-density plasma region if the confined ions were focused at the center of the sphere. While Hirsch worked with Farnsworth to demonstrate early experimental success with IEC experiments, the concept passed from view as magnetic and inertial confinement research exponentiated. Then in the late 1990s R. W. Bussard revived the concept with a hybrid IEC magnetic approach. In this approach the electrons were confined in the magnetic field, forming a potentials trap for ions. Note the similarity to the original conceptual potential well discussed by Elmore, et al. Upon invitation by R. W. Bussard to join this effort, the author, George Miley, undertook supporting experiments that were a variation of the original Hirsch approach, using electrostatic grids to form a trap with ions that then brought electrons in. He realized that this approach could result in a very attractive low-level neutron source for neutron activation applications, and began that development. Such work was soon taken up in several other laboratories, including Los Alamos National Laboratory, LANL, University of Wisconsin and Kyoto University. Meanwhile Bussard's work continued with strong funding from the military. However, little was published or known about this until 2008 when he made public appeals on YouTube to regain funding stopped just when the experiment achieved a major success. Subsequently, funding resumed but R. W. Bussard passed away shortly thereafter due to a long battle with cancer. His company and work were then taken over by R. Nebel, who took leave from LAM to undertake this new work. That effort is now in progress and represents the largest IEC power-oriented project in the US or elsewhere, but still modest with a half-dozen senior scientists involved. Meanwhile, laboratories elsewhere working on IEC neutron sources have continued, while the U of Wisconsin has added an IEC proton source as an option using similar technology. The labs, including the Iec, have fusion power as an ultimate goal, but must focus on their funded near-term spin-off projects. At this point the IEC still receives no funding from DOE, which remains focused on the tokamak route to fusion power. Thus, with little funding, slow progress has been made in answering the key question of whether or not the IEC can be developed for fusion power. If it can, the device would be simpler and smaller than a tokamak, making it an extremely attractive option. In addition, its beam-like reactions, highly non-Maxwellian, make the IEC very well suited for burning alternate, advanced, fuels like D3He and P3313, which are much more environmentally favorable than conventional DT fusion. Unfortunately, tokamaks are not well equipped to go forward to such fuels. On the other hand, the use of non-power producing IECs for other applications, such as small neutron, proton, and X-ray sources, has been amply demonstrated. Now, the issue is how well and in what applications the IEC sources compete commercially with other options such as accelerator target sources. This report is intended to provide the reader with important insight into the physics and technology of IECs relative to both power and neutron/proton/X-ray sources. With this background, hopefully the reader can formulate an opinion about the potential for IEC applications. Due to the limited funding for IEC research to date, much more has to be done to actually demonstrate its application, especially for power production. thus that opinion must remain a personal one for the reader. One other limitation of this report is that it largely provides details based on the author's work on IECs over the last decade. Thus it will not do justice to the ongoing work by others, notably at EMC2 on the Busar Polywell device or the advanced gridded IEC neutron/proton source development work at the U of Wisconsin, Kyoto University, and Tokyo Institute of Technology. Some insight into these efforts is given in comments and in references supplied, but the reader is encouraged to discuss that work with those individuals directly. Iec Basics. We begin by presenting the early very basic theoretical study by Elmore, Tuck, and Watson that addresses the key question of the fusion power density obtainable with potential well confinement. One of their basic assumptions is that the potential well is dug by electrons which trap ions. Certain added assumptions lead to well depth, etc., and finally they conclude that the system is unstable for ion densities sufficiently high that appreciable thermonuclear yield is expected. They qualify this conclusion saying admittedly, a more thorough investigation is required to obtain a complete understanding of stability of this electrostatic device. This result was quite negative for electron formation of potential wells, but left the route possibly open since the subject needed a more thorough investigation. Later, for various reasons, R. W. Busar still pursued this concept by introducing the High Energy Power Source, HEPS, polywell device which uses a spherical simulated magnetic field to stabilize the potential well formed by electrons. This represents a hybrid magnetic IEC confinement system where electrons are confined by the magnetic fields, forming the potential well which traps ions. Apparently, Busar's view was that this added magnetic stabilization would overcome the earlier Elmore and Tuck criticism. Subsequently, some of his reports used particle and cell simulations to support the view that such a stabilized electron potential well would allow adequate density for attractive fusion densities. However, the next IEC experiments following the Elmore et al. Analysis, prior to Busar's, were the Hirsch-Farnsworth experiments which used ion, versus electron, injected traps, as does the present author's work. This selection was largely driven by the desire to gain added stability by the large momentum of recirculating ions that form the potential well. More about ion versus electron injection routes will be covered in later sections. Next, it is important to review the multiple well, Poiseuille solution, Farnsworth-Hirsch found for ion-injected formation of potential wells in spherical geometry. This is described in the paper by Hirsch. As seen from Figure 1.2, non-energetic ions with angular momentum drag in electrons to create onion skin-like nested potential wells around the center of the sphere such that the ion density goes to infinity in zero volume at the origin.